We are very fortunate in having an especially inspiring speaker this morning. I have had the pleasure of hearing our speaker, and I'm in a unique position, and it is an empowering position because I know something that most of you don't. I know how inspired you're going to be, and I know how moved you're going to be, and I know how pleased you're going to be. He, in fact, was in what was known as the Hanoi Hilton. He was a prisoner of war and would remain so for 5.5 years. Our guest this morning. He went on in his Navy career after he was released in 1972, and he ended up with the naval program, in charge of the naval program for management and leadership training, appropriately so, as you'll soon hear. He's a remarkable American, a remarkable man who went through a remarkable experience he's now going to share with us. Please welcome Captain David Carey.
I am delighted to be with you this morning. Thanks. I wonder how many of you here this morning remember the 31st of August, 1967. And you do. We'll talk about that later. And by the way, I don't want to know how old some of you may have been the 31st of August, 1960, or if some of you were the 31st of August, 1967. That day stands out in my mind as though it's etched in pure crystal. I remember every detail of it. At the time, I was a younger naval aviator flying off the aircraft carrier Oriskany. We were stationed off the Gulf of Tonkin. 31st of August, we manned aircraft at about 7 o'clock in the morning. It had been raining, drizzling all night long. It was one of those days at sea when there's no horizon. The sky just goes from over your head to under your feet. It's all gray. We launched airplanes about 8 o'clock, rendezvoused 16 aircraft, overhead the carrier, got organized, pointed the noses toward the coast of North Vietnam. The target that day was a small railroad bridge just inland from the port city of Haiphong. We crossed the coast. The North Vietnamese started to shoot, as they always did. That day I remember very clearly. They fired 2 surface-air missiles in succession from way out in front of us. Well, back in those days, surface-air missile was the size of a telephone pole. And when they launched them, there was so much flame from the launch rocket, it kicked up the dust. You could see it for miles. And once they had them in the air, the booster rocket burned so brightly, you could track them for a long distance off. I sat there in my cockpit that day, and I watched the first missile sit on my windshield. A little pinpoint of light got brighter and bigger and brighter and bigger, till finally it started to move. As soon as it started to move, I knew it wouldn't hit me. So I turned my attention to the second missile. It sat out there on my windshield, just this little pinpoint of light, and it grew brighter and brighter and brighter. So finally I decided, if it's not going to move, I'll have to. So that day, rather than turn my airplane go left through all the other airplanes out here on my left, what I decided to do was roll the airplane up on its back, across the top of the only airplane on the right, come down on the outside and press on. Seemed like a good idea at the time until I was over top of the airplane on my right. The missile went right between us with a huge explosion. The fireball blew the tail section off my airplane. The airplane stayed on it's back, started spinning and gyrating like mad, falling through the sky. I had all the flying characteristics of a brick. and the stick was limp in my hands. The rudder pedals were against the firewall. The airplane continued to gyrate, and I promise you this, every time the nose of that airplane went by the water was safety for me, it would hesitate. And I would think, it's going to fly. And I'd start stirring the stick and kicking the pedals. The nose would whip off. I got a glimpse of my altimeter going through 4,000 feet, ejected from the airplane, had a parachute, landed in the middle of a small North Vietnamese village. I was immediately surrounded by about 1 million North Vietnamese. That's an exaggeration. There were 980,000 of them. It took them 32 seconds to capture me. They tied me up with 6 miles of rope. And once they had me all tied up, they decided they wanted to undress me. They didn't untie me. They took a machete made out of the leaf spring of a car and they grabbed handfuls of my gear from between the rope, and they began to hack away on it. I had on all my flight gear. How many of you have seen Top Gun? Or maybe some of you worked on Top Gun. You remember the scene in the movie where Tom Cruise and Goose are walking back across the tarmac carrying their helmets with all their flight gear on, G-suits and torso harness? That's the way I looked. Of course, I was a little better looking than Tom Cruise. They chopped away everything. So I stood there with my 6 miles of rope and my undershorts. That would start what for me would turn out to be a little more than 5.5 years in prison in North Vietnam. The question I'm most frequently asked about that is this: how did you do that? How did you do that for 5.5 years? How could you do that? So that's the question I want to talk with you about for a short time this morning. However, I don't think it's wise for us to dwell on the past unless there's something that we can learn from that we can use in our lives, in our professions, here and now. I want to be able to make those kinds of connections with you. Now, I know from experience that I can make some of those connections with you. I also know that you can make a lot more than I can make. So I want you to listen this morning with this question in mind. So what? What's that mean to me? So what can I take away from that? I'd like to have you do some real-time integration. How did we do it? The answer is very simple in my mind. We did what we had to do. We did our best. We kept our sense of humor. We chose to grow, and we kept the faith. Faith in ourselves and faith in each other, faith in this country, and faith in God. I see those lessons as directly translatable into your lives. After all, how do you do it when you have problems? How do you do it when things aren't going right in your life? How do you choose to do it in the face of adversity? Above and beyond that, just day in and day out, sometimes it's tough. How do you do it? I hesitate to use the word normal. I know a lot of us don't think there are any such things as normal days. But how do you do it? How do you do it? Do you do what you have to do? You do your best? Do you keep your sense of humor? Are you growing? Do you keep the faith? But wait, I shouldn't be pressing you so hard just yet. I owe you some answers first. How did we do it? Well, let me set the scene for you. For years I was kept locked up in cells. By the way, we didn't call them cells. We called them rooms. And we had roommates, not cellmates. That's psychological warfare, you know. We were kept locked up in rooms that were never quite big enough for the number of men that lived in them. I lived for months by myself. I lived with a group of 20 men for a year and a half one time. The average number of us that were together were probably 6 or 7. We were not allowed to see or have any contact with any Americans outside of ourselves. So the very first thing we did was get in contact with everybody we could get in contact with. Somehow we knew instinctively that it would be critical to our survival for us to be able to be in touch with each other, to be able to have this communications link set up, to be able to be in contact. So today, when I talk about sending messages around the camp and doing things like that, what you have to picture is a scene in which one American has his ear pressed to the wall, he's tapping on it in a code. On the other side of the wall, there's another American, he's listening. And all the roommates, they've got their eyes and ears pressed to the cracks in the doors and the shutters, watching for the guards. Because for us to be caught brought swift and painful retribution. Of course, they had to catch us first. But once we had the communications network set up, the very next thing we did, just as you would have done, was to work out the entertainment schedule. Now, here's the way we did that. We used to have room meetings. By the way, we always had 100% attendance at our room meetings. At those meetings, we would talk about movie stars, movies, books, authors. It would be enough for you to let slip that you had read War and Peace. We'd schedule you to tell us War and Peace. We could do it whenever. Next week, next month, 6 months from now. We had time. The process would then be to talk to all the roommates, find out if anybody had read War and Peace, ever heard of War and Peace, knew anything about it. Send a message around the camp. Pretty soon you knew everything. Anybody knew about War and Peace. Then you just fill in the blanks. On the appointed night, we'd be locked up. Everybody would flop at their place in the concrete, and you'd tell us War and Peace. I received an Academy Award. After I'd been there for a number of years and moved from cell to cell and prison to prison, I moved in with that group of 20 men that I mentioned to you. My reputation preceded me. They wanted to know, when can you tell us, Dr. Zhivago? I told them, anytime. So we scheduled it for Sunday night at the movie. I had 3 men, they sat over here. When I'd nod my head, they'd start up with Laura's theme. I told Zhivago in the first person. I was Alec Guinness, the brother, searching for the lost daughter. You remember the story? Took me 5 hours. The conclusion of which was a spontaneous standing ovation. They gave me the Oscar right there on the spot. How did we do it? The next thing we did was to educate ourselves. We taught each other everything we'd ever known, and lots of things we'd never known. It was a matter of choice to learn and to grow and not sit there and vegetate. I learned to play the piano when I was in prison. I lived with a fellow taking piano lessons as a child. We decided I should learn to play. So we took toilet paper, picture in your mind a very low quality grocery bag. We glued it together with rice. We took ashes and drew a keyboard on it. John taught me all the little finger exercises that go along with playing the piano. He taught me how to read the keyboard. He taught me how to read music. I used to practice for hours. On Sundays, I would give concerts. I would take my piano and spread it out at my end of the room. I have played some of the most beautiful music in the world. I have most certainly played with greater enthusiasm than anyone has ever played. My roommates loved it, of course. Well, for starters, if they didn't like what I was playing, they could listen to something else. They would always applaud wildly. I always tried to leave them begging. And in the intervening years since I've been back home, I have seated myself in front of a piano. I don't know what was wrong with that piano. It wasn't anything like it was in my head. It was so beautiful in my head. And when I tried with a real piano, it was, well, quite candidly, it was terrible. I find a lot of things to be that way. Perhaps you do too. They're so perfect in our heads. Have you ever noticed that? The way we want to communicate with the people around us, there's no doubt in my mind. How about at your work? The way you get organized. It's all so perfect up here in our heads. And then we go through this whole process of getting it out of us and translate it and across to someone else and make something happen. And it always gets messed up. How many of you have children at home? I have 2 children at home. In my head, I know how to raise perfect children. Sometimes I wonder what's going on at home. Speaking of perfect, I tell you the perfect example. I can't begin to explain to you how excited I am to be with you this morning. Because you see, this morning, I'm going to have an opportunity to have a positive impact in your lives. When I drove up from San Diego yesterday, all the way up, I was thinking about what I wanted to tell you, how I was going to tell you these things, what I should say to you, how I should do this. I've been going over my lines and over my lines. And I want you to know this. No matter what happens in here this morning, in my car yesterday, it was perfect. Things are just that way. I learned to type when I was in prison. Same sort of process. Fellow taught me the keyboard, ASD, SD. I used to fold my blanket into kind of a slanty shape, like a typewriter. I sat there for hours and typed my memoirs. I've written letters to everyone you and I know. How many of you type? For those of you who type, down in the bottom right hand of your keyboard, there's a little key. Allows you to go back and correct your mistake. I never used it. It'd be enough for you to let slip you'd taken a geology course. You teach us geology. That's the same sort of process as the movies. Find out what everybody knew about rocks, mud, dirt, eventually teach the course. I was a French professor. The way that came about was this. They came in one day and took 2 of us out of the room and split us up and commenced to beat on us. They told us they had a guard listening outside. He heard us talking about things we weren't allowed to talk about. 6 weeks later, when they dumped the two of us back into the room, the roommates want to know what's happening. We said, oh, we are getting in so much trouble. They don't understand English very well, and they're listening, and they're thinking we're talking about. We came to the only logical conclusion, which was we would quit speaking English. What we decided to speak was Pig Latin. We set aside a whole evening to review the rules for the grammatical construction of Pig Latin. That takes 45 seconds. Next morning, at the crack of dawn, we started speaking nothing but Pig Latin. I don't know if you've ever spoken nothing but Pig Latin. I can tell you how long you can speak nothing but Pig Latin before you go start raving mad. Takes about 4.5 hours. It was in the middle of that I let slip that I had taken French. I had 2 years in high school, 2 years at the Naval Academy. My roommates, who were going crazy trying to speak Pig Latin, decided we should immediately shift to French. It didn't matter, mind you, I didn't learn anything in those 4 years. Now, I know school's different nowadays. So my roommates insisted. They're going crazy speaking Pig Latin. I quick sent a message around the camp. I'm now the French professor. Anybody knows any French words, send them over here. I got to have vocabulary. And I began to teach French. I used to hit the older Vietnamese officers up for some help if they'd come around. A lot of them spoke French from the French occupation of Indochina. I would say to them, I'm a French professor, and all this in French, mind you. And I don't know how to say, I need some help. They'd always pop up a little bit, teach the Americans some French. I taught French for years. When we came back to this country, I had 6 men absolutely fluent in the French language. According to me. There were some problems with that language. I had to make some things up. But boy, could they talk. We had a speech class when we were in prison. Well, you can picture this. Group of men locked up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Our language deteriorated so badly. We used 4-letter words for everything. As a matter of fact, we couldn't speak without 4-letter words. We used capitalization, hyphenation, exclamation, declaration, everything was a 4-letter. Finally, it dawned on us one day it would be unacceptable to talk that way when we came back to this country. We decided to do a couple of things. The more energetic amongst us decided that every time we slipped, we'd do 5 push-ups. Well, by about 7 o'clock in the morning, my arms had hurt so bad. We also decided to start a speech class. It turns out my piano teacher knew all about that kind of thing. So we had a formal speech class every week. There had been a master of ceremonies assigned. You would have been assigned to prepare a 20-minute sales presentation on the industrial application of left-handed widgets. 15-minute informative presentation on the mating habits of the bull elephant. We'd have impromptu and extemporaneous speeches. There were judges assigned. There was an counter. Someone to count all the mental hiccups. Like, you know? In the back of the room, some poor soul was the timekeeper. Had to sit back there and count to himself. 2001, 2002, 2003. Hold up the right number of fingers so we could see how we were doing. I learned to play cards when I was in prison. I learned to play all kinds of cards. I play a mean hand of poker. We didn't have cards. We made cards out of toilet paper. Not my piano. But we made them out of toilet paper. And I can tell you this about toilet paper cards. They're doggone hard to shuffle. How did we do it? Those were some of the ways we did it. We re-remembered and memorized everything. For some reason, it was important to be able to rattle off names of 50 states and their capitals in alphabetical order just as fast as I'm talking to you now. Or the name of every teacher you ever had in your life in chronological order. Or the name of every student in your 5th grade homeroom. Yeah? I'm now convinced, I'm completely convinced, that everything we're exposed to all the time is recorded up here between our ears. We have it all. We're putting it in there all the time. It's just a matter of being able to recall it. When I was first captured, they took me to Hanoi, and they began to interrogate me. They wanted to know some things. I wanted to tell them name, rank, serial number, date of birth. They really wanted to know some things. The interrogations led to beating. The beatings led to torture. Till finally, after a period of time, and I'd like to be able to tell you it took weeks. It didn't take weeks. After a period of time, I hurt so bad. And they really wanted to know some stuff. And I begged them to kill me. They wouldn't kill me. Finally, we got to the point. I tried some of that Rambo stuff, too, by the way. That's only in the movies where that works. It doesn't work in real life. I hurt so bad. I got to the point where I knew that if this kept up, I was going to go crazy. The pain was so bad. I didn't want to go crazy. The reason I didn't want to go crazy was because even as a junior officer, I had my little bitty share of military secrets. And I figured if I were crazy, there'd be no telling what I might say to these people. So what I decided to do was hold out to the last possible second and lie. And we got to the last possible second. And I lied like crazy. And the interrogator, he writes everything down. How many of you have experience with interrogators? Okay. I wouldn't be so quick to answer that question. How many of you have bosses? Okay. You got one? Hey, how many of you have spouses? Okay, this will not be totally unfamiliar to you. The interrogator writes everything down. When he's finally finished with me, he left. Now I'll try to describe the situation. I hurt so bad. I can't describe the pain to you. I could not get up off the floor. My arms didn't work anymore. My arms didn't work for months. I ate by wiggling on my belly, stick my face in a bowl of rice. The pain was incredible. But worse than that was in my head. It's the only time I've ever been like this in my life. I could not focus my mind. I could not pick a subject and think about it. I desperately wanted to pick a subject. The subject I wanted to pick were lies I had told. Because I knew, even if he looks in that book, they'll be back. At least I could start with the same lies. But I had no control over my mind. It ricocheted around the inside of my head. Think about crazy things, like the dog I had when I was a kid, or a home in Jeanette, or the first car I had. I could not get at something focused. Into my head came the first line of the 23rd Psalm. And that line kept coming back into my head. And it kept coming. I had learned the 23rd Psalm when I was a little bitty child in Sunday school. And over the years, I had drifted away from church and those kinds of things. It had been easily 15 years since I thought of the 23rd Psalm. But that line kept coming into my mind. The Lord is my shepherd. And kind of by accident, hit or miss, I discovered that if I would think about that line, I could think about that line. Well, my mother didn't raise any dummies. I started thinking about that line. I worked on that line for days, till finally, from somewhere, way back here in my head, I was able to dredge up the whole 23rd Psalm. And I discovered after I had done that I had control of my mind back. I don't think that was any accident. But the point is this. It's all up here. We're carrying it around with us all the time. We're putting it in there every day, and you have it. So I think I understand better now why we're exhorted to think on those things that are kind, lovely, just, true, pure. It's because what you put in, you store. And what you store is going to flavor every aspect of your personality and your character and your life. You'd be absolutely amazed what you could remember if I took you out there and locked you in that bathroom for a year. It's all up there. We had a fellow lived with us in prison who, when he was a child, his parents used to insist every year that he memorize a poem which he would then recite at the annual family Thanksgiving dinner. He hated it, of course. But now, years later, Norm was able to recall great quantities of poetry. We'd get a message come tap through the wall and say, Norm is working on The Highwayman. He is stuck on the line that comes after, plaiting a dark red love knot into her long black hair. Can anyone help? We love to get those messages. For starters, we could discuss for days whether anyone had ever heard the Highwaymen, read the Highwaymen, knew anything about the Highwaymen. Then we could take some more days, make up some lines to send back to Norm. Didn't matter if we knew anything about the Highwaymen. Norm was working hard over there. We wanted to help. Eventually, through the wall, a line at a time, would come the Highwaymen. And we'd memorize it as it came. We had all kinds of things memorized. Some of the things we memorized for the beauty of the words. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach when feeling out of sight, for the ends of being and ideal grace. I love thee to the level of every day's most quiet need, by sun and candlelight. Some of the things we memorized for the sound of the words. Strange things are done in the midnight sun by the men who moil for gold, and the Arctic trails have their secret tales that make your blood run cold. The northern lights have seen queer sights. The queerest they ever did see was that night on the marge of Lake Labarge, where I cremated Sam McGee. Other things had great significance for us personally. If you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve their term long after they are gone, so go on when there is nothing in you except the will which says to them, hang on. In the felt clutch of circumstance, I have not whined nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeoning of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil. For thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest the table before me in the presence of mine enemies. My cup runneth over. I suppose it was natural, since we were so enamored with those kinds of things, that we would try to write some poetry ourselves. I wrote a poem in French. Does anybody in here speak French? We'll skip that. First verse. Je me demande comment dit-on tuer le monde à moi, par je veux dire ces choses chéries à toi, autant que moi. They said it was perfect. Well, I have a good friend, I remember when he wrote his first poem. It was after the first meal of the day. We were almost always fed twice a day. Meals always consisted of a bowl of soup and either a bowl of rice or a hunk of a heavy old doughy French bread. That day it was bread. Jerry took a bite out of it, he looked down, he started his first poem. It went like this. Little weevil in my bread. I think I just bit off your head. Poem kind of went downhill from there. But it got him started. How did we do it? We laughed a lot. Laughter was the only way we could cope with the situation. Was the only way we could release the pressure. Was the only way we could handle and keep balance and perspective in our lives. We had a place we called Heartbreak Hotel, which was 8 cells, 4 on the side. Old cell number 8 down at the end had been converted over to a shower. They had run a rusty water pipe in there, up the wall, bent it over at the top. Eventually, after your arrival at Hanoi, when they were finished with you, sooner or later, the guards came and got you. And they would get you up off the floor, kick you, push you, drag you, shove you, get you down there, throw you in cell number 8, slam the door behind you and tell you, wash. You'd stand there in a filthy, slimy pit, whatever rags you had left, hurting in body and spirit. Eventually, somehow, get that water turned on, let it run down over you. It felt so good. Sooner or later, you had to look up. Right there in the concrete, it said, smile, the on-candid camera. was the only way we could balance this life out. It was the only way we could cope with it. You've all been in situations where the tension, where it was so tense that if somebody hadn't said something so we could laugh, we all started bleeding from our eyeballs or something. Yes. I like the definition of humor that it's like that it is emotional chaos, often remembered in times of tranquility. We had a prison we called Alcatraz, which was 12 single-man cells. When you lived at Alcatraz, you wore leg irons all the time. They were, just picture a couple shackles go over your ankles and steel bars through the back of them. One day the guards at Alcatraz decided they were going to have the Americans wash out their cells. So they took all the leg irons off, threw them in a pile in the center of the courtyard, started with the first American on this end, and by the end of the day, they had all gone out and drawn water and washed their cells out. The guard grabbed the first set of leg irons he could find and went into the nearest cell. The American who was in there allowed as how, "Those are not my leg irons. I want my leg irons. I'm not putting those on." The guards had no idea how to, they didn't speak the same language. The guards had no idea what to do. Pretty soon they had 3 or 4 guards running all over Alcatraz with handfuls of leg irons. Nobody put them on. They solved that in their own inimitable way, of course. Next morning, a senior American officer in Alcatraz, after thinking about that, sent a message to the rest of the guys that went something like this: "When we go back to the United States, I don't think we should talk to the shrinks." And he knew it was emotional chaos. I've been reading Iacocca's book lately. Don't tell me how it ends. I'm still working on the first book. I decided early in that book I like Iacocca's dad. He says in there, my dad used to always say to us, no matter how bad things get, remember, this too shall pass. And he's right, of course. No matter what, this too shall pass. Humor was the only way we could keep the balance in our lives. So I wonder how you do that in your life. I wonder how you keep perspective and balance. One of the things I learned when I was in prison is this: I know clearly, unequivocally, beyond a shadow of a doubt, who's responsible for the balance in your life. You are. Nobody else is going to do that. Nobody else wants to, nobody else can, nobody else will. It's up to us. We have to figure out a way to do that. We did it through laughter. When one fellow went to interrogation, the interrogator wanted to know, in your country, where do your parents live? He told him, Kansas. What do they do? They're farmers. What do they grow? They grow up stuff. Later on that day, the interrogator took him back to his cell, and the interrogator came to our cell. The doors had a little trap door on them. The little peep door opens up, bang! And there stands the elf. We had names for these people. And the elf wants to know, what's up, Doc? What's up, Doc? What's up, Doc? Yeah. We are thinking to ourselves, the elf has popped his cork. He demands to know, what's up, Doc? He's getting... Second thing about interrogators, it's not good for them to get excited. Now maybe you can identify with bosses and spouses more closely. He demands the little veins are standing out on his head. You know, what's up, Doc? Give us a hint, give us a hint. He said, goes on farm in Kansas. Oh, up, Doc. It's about this high. Looks a little bit like maize. We use it for soup as a red flower. See, we taught him what's up, Doc. How did we do it? Those were some of the ways we did it. We did what we had to do. We did our best. We kept our sense of humor. We learned and grew. We kept the faith. Faith in ourselves. Faith in our ability to endure, to gut it out. Tomorrow was going to come, and I was going to be there. I see that as directly translatable into your lives. Faith in ourselves, confidence in our ability to do things that we must do, to endure, to handle problems. There are prison-like aspects of my daily life right now, and I'll venture to say of your life too. But I have duties, responsibilities, obligations. Faith in ourselves, our ability to do those things. Faith in ourselves is confidence to be able to stand up and espouse that in which we believe, not be embarrassed. To be able to say, this is right and this is wrong and this is where I stand, not be ashamed. Faith in ourselves. We did it through faith in each other. I've lived with men who, if they didn't hold my life in their hands, they held the next best thing to it. And I always knew that they would do the very best that they could do. And then when a shoe was on the other foot, they granted that to me, that I would do the best that I could do. That was all I could do. Faith in each other. Confidence in each other. It's that kind of faith and trust and confidence in each other that allows us to work together. That's the foundation of teamwork. The illustrations in sports are very easy to see. The quarterback throws a pass down there to where no one stands, knowing that the tight end will get there when the ball gets there. And that's faith and trust and confidence that allows that team. A lot of work, too. Or the third baseman fields the ball. Maybe not the Orioles' third baseman. Third baseman fields the ball. He throws it over there to where no one stands. And when the ball gets there, the first baseman will be there. Faith in each other. Trust in each other. We did it through faith in this country. We live in the greatest nation that has ever existed on the face of the earth. A land of freedom, opportunity, achievement. And yet we are so overpowered with what's wrong with this country. That's not kept in the right balance or perspective either. We're inundated with everything that's wrong with this country. Recently I was laying on the couch. I don't want to give you the wrong idea. I was laying on the couch. My wife was reading the paper. She said, would you like some of the newspaper? I said, no. Find something good in there and read it to me. She rummaged around in that paper for an hour. She never did read me anything good. Now that's, on that day in history, in this nation of ours, how much good do you think happened as opposed to how much bad do you think happened? It's overwhelming. But yet you see, it gets all out of balance in perspective. We have to keep that in balance. We did it through faith in God. I was never alone over there. I've lived with men who profess to be atheists and agnostics. I believe it was more difficult for them, and I don't think that was any accident. Sometimes I think we get so materially oriented, so egocentric. We take so much for granted. We forget how blessed we are. We forget the spiritual roots upon which this country was founded. How did you do it? We do it? There. That's how we did it. What can be learned from my experience? Let me submit quickly these couple of things to you. The first is this. As Scott Peck says in the first line of The Road Less Traveled, life is difficult. Now the working person's corollary for that is, you're going to have problems at work. That's the way it's supposed to be. But there's a mindset that, oh, no, it's not supposed to be that way. It's supposed to come to me on a silver platter. It's supposed to be bed of roses. Hey, I hear us. When things aren't going right, we'll run around saying, why me? Why is this happening to me? When things are going right, I don't hear anybody run around saying, why me? Why is this happening to me? See, it's a mindset. And if your mindset is supposed to come to you on a platter, be a bed of roses, then life or work will be terribly, terribly frustrating. Second thing I'll submit to you is this. We get through problems, we get through adversity, we get through just day to day, a little bit at a time. Just a step at a time sometimes. Just a little bit. It's like my kids used to run around the house saying, Daddy, how do you eat an elephant? You eat him a bite at a time. Then you eat till he's gone. It's not given to us to know that. It's given to us to do our best, do what we have to do, grow, keep our sense of humor, keep the faith. Hey, when I was upside down in that airplane coming through the sky like a ton of lead, if anybody ever said to me, jump out of that airplane, you'll be in prison for 5.5 years, I don't know what I'd have done. That's inconceivable in my mind, and I did it. But it's not given to us to know. Just a little bit at a time. Last thing is this. Through the grace of God, we are equipped with what we need to be able to handle, face adversity, deal with problems, live our lives, contribute, have an impact. It's there. Built in. Factory equipment. I'm no different than you are. Think of this. I want you to think, and I know that everyone in here can find one, I want you to think of the last cataclysmic experience in your life. The last real crisis, when things were coming apart at the seams. The last really big problem you had. For me, that was about a year ago. My son broke his leg skiing. He forgot the lesson about going around the trees. They brought that little guy down in the gurney thing. He was laying there. He's all covered with blood. He was shaking. His mother and I were overwhelmed. We went out there. Oh my God! It was an oh my Godder. Oh my God! We're here a million miles from nowhere. What? Look at this poor little kid. It was broke right across the knee. And then the next thing they did, they put him in a cast. Went from his ankle to his chest. I had a 12-year-old board at home. And his mother and I are thinking, oh, how are we ever going to get through this? How are we going to, Now, I ask you to think of the last experience you had. And I'll wager that on the front end, as it's starting, that's the way it's looking. It's an oh my Godder. Oh, how am I ever going to, oh my God. Now, in retrospect, I look back on that broken leg, and we handled that pretty well. My son showed me things I was beginning to wonder if he had in him. Character and strength. We did pretty well. Oh, it was tough. We had a lot of problems. It wasn't easy. But we did, and I wager again that the experience I asked you to think about, you got through it pretty well. Somehow you managed to get through that. It was tough. It wasn't easy. Who in here was in charge of counting how many times I said it was easy this morning? See, I didn't say it was easy. I never said it was easy. It was so doggone tough you can't believe it. But that's the way it's supposed to be. That's the way these things are. And we get through them a little bit at a time. How do you do it? How do you choose to deal with problems, adversity? How do you choose to live your lives? Do your job. You do what you have to do. You do your best. You keep your sense of humor. Are you growing? You keep the faith. I've gone full circle now. I'm back to you. I'm reminded of a couplet by Henry Brinkers goes, God asks no one to accept life. That's not the choice. You must take it. The only choice is how. How do you choose to do that? Perhaps that's the most important question in the morning. In the first line of A Tale of Two Cities, Charles Dickens wrote, this was the best of all time, and this was the worst of all time. He's absolutely right. This is the best of all time, and this is the worst of all time. Which it is up to us. All my experience teaches me that you can choose to make this the best of all time. And I urge you to make that choice so this be the best of all time. Thank you. God bless you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Please be seated.